So let's just talk a little bit about, rhythm in music and how you go about thinking about it. It's the rhythm and the beat of something is hugely important. I think the success of a lot of songs and records is simply based on how captivating and compelling the rhythm of it is. And there's a lot of different ways to think about that and portray it. How do you take a song that is written on a guitar, like an acoustic guitar, and then turn it into a fuller arrangement with rhythm being played on drums or percussion and just other things, and deciding what is appropriate or what could be. There are no rules for it, and it's hard to sort of like quantify it in that, for me to be able to say, well, if you have this, then do that. But typically what'll happen is something that's written on just a single instrument, it will have some of the rhythmic information already built in and implied in what's going on. And so if you're going to put drums to it, you need to play with that, accentuate it, give it a foundation to live with and on top of, but then realize that maybe some of that rhythm that was in that initial version of the song now is being transferred to another instrument. And so maybe the original instrument will have to simplify so that, because in the end result, you don't want everything playing together and playing the same rhythms. You want it to divvy up the rhythms and divide the syncopation and let several instruments carry the rhythm. I think that's, in pop music, sometimes you have a very simple drum pattern because there's there's things that are playing arpeggiations, or the vocal rhythm can change against a very predictable simple rhythm to change the feel. It's not necessarily, like I said, it's not really a cut and dry black and white thing to explain, and it does take experimentation. And the things that I think about are just making sure that everything isn't doing the same rhythm. Obviously, the drummer and the bass player, for the most part, need to have an understanding and a relationship in terms of what their rhythms are doing with the kick drum and what the bass player is playing. That is what feels good and what is very common in music. So that's kind of a relationship to pay attention to. But if you've got like a guitar part that's kind of doing chugging eighth notes, well, you don't want the snare drum, playing like a busy pattern necessarily. I mean, maybe you do, maybe you don't. It's just thinking about how to divide up the rhythms and separate the responsibility of the rhythms to create the contrast and texture and depth. And that just takes experimenting. Oftentimes when I'm just listening to a very simple demo, I just kind of pay attention to the way it makes me feel and the way I might want to move, or like how I tap my foot, or what feels emphasized in that rhythm. And then, okay, we'll start to think about what would be a cool sound or a cool way to do that rhythm to accompany this. And then when you do that, maybe then you realize, well, that's a necessary part of the rhythm, but to have them both doing it is not the thing I want to have happen. So probably try to take away that rhythm from the acoustic guitar so that I can have drums with it, and that I'm forming a relationship. Or if it doesn't feel right to take that rhythm away from the acoustic guitar, well, figure out how the drums can play that same rhythm, but in a way that's maybe not as forceful or more complementary to what the guitar is doing. Instead of it being a certain rhythm being reinforced with the snare drum, maybe it's better with the floor tom, because the floor tom is darker and heavier. It'll add weight and substance to that particular rhythmic note, but it's not going to be as forward feeling as the acoustic guitar. And it really just takes some experimenting. That's the other reason why you also want to, if you can, and hire talented musicians, hire people that are really good at their instrument, because they naturally will be able to feel that stuff and help put it together and then bring it together as a team. That's one of the reasons why I really think it's important to typically record drums and bass together, because that's a relationship that needs to be worked out. And as you'll observe in this course, when we're working on the Bury It song, there's a moment in working on the drum and bass performance where we have to figure out something that's going on in the choruses, where there's a pushed note and then a downbeat, and then should we play what should we play, and how should we play it, and then making sure that the two musicians are on the same page and making the choice that feels best. Because if we had only done one at a time, it might not be as obvious of a conflict, and then when the other player would come in later subsequently and try to play it, then we'd realize like, oh, this is maybe not working. And you can probably address it in some way, but I just think it's better to be able to work those things out. But if you've got a really cool drum loop or a program track already going, and then I'd have the bass player come in before I would add more drums to it. I'd get that relationship sort of advanced a little bit. So what I'm saying is like, if I have an acoustic guitar song and I've put a little bit of drum programming to it, and that drum programming feels good, the next thing I do, if I would just get the bass, I would get a bass part down before I started adding more rhythm to it. And that's a generality though, because it really depends on the genre. It's really thinking about dividing up rhythms, creating depth and contrast, and the ability for, like let's say you have a simple drum pattern going, and adding a tambourine or some other rhythmic thing over the top of it will make a section feel elevated and busier and more compelling and give it more momentum or just a different feel. But the simpler drum pattern can keep going, and then you take that element away, the added element away again later, and then you get back to a familiar thing, but the dynamic has come down, and you've opened up the space, and then maybe something else starts to play that rhythm that tambourine rhythm. Maybe the tambourine rhythm's in the chorus, and then you go to another section like a verse or a bridge, and the tambourine goes away, but then you have something that's arpeggiating on a keyboard, or there's a guitar picking pattern, or that rhythm is taken over by another percussion element. It's just important to think about it in those ways. And sometimes it's great for everybody to play the same rhythm and emphasize the same thing for certain moments in a song or certain sections. But if you have a whole song where someone's strumming the acoustic guitar on the eighth notes, and the drummer's playing eighth notes on the hi-hat and playing all the backbeats, all the twos and fours, and then the electric guitar player is chugging along on eighth notes. So it's like you have 3 or 4 minutes of that. It's going to sound pretty stale and linear, and to me, that's probably not good arranging. There are songs that work very well that way, and you can build on top of that, and it can be very compelling. Maybe that's the mood of it, and that's okay. But I'm just saying that's not as typical, and you need to think about how to divide these things up and provide opportunities to have things coming in and out of the arrangement for syncopation to be traded off to other instruments, and really just concentrate on the depth of the arrangement. Deciding rhythms is that just takes experimenting. I think making beats and coming up with rhythms people spend hours doing that, and hours finding the right sounds to make certain rhythms sound cool. So, and that's another reason to study music and study all kinds of different music, and to sort of start to pick up and identify what rhythms people are using for certain feels, certain tempos, what instrument choices are used to do those things. And sometimes it's genre specific, and just to sort of be aware of it so that you can, that's the only way to really teach yourself. And then you have to use your personal taste and your intuition to try and experiment and figure that stuff out. But that's just a little bit of insight and direction about the way I think about it, and a few pointers about how I start and what I'm trying to look out for in organizing the rhythmic elements of a production. So just like some further examples of rhythm development in a song, like James Bay Collide. Early in the song, first verse, there's a little shaker pattern that comes in very subtly. And then when it goes to the pre-chorus, some rim clicks start playing a bit of that rhythm that the shaker has introduced into the song. And then you get to the first chorus, and the rim clicks continue and claps come in for the backbeats, the 2s and the 4s in the chorus. And then what happens in the second chorus are that you have the claps on the backbeat, but then the drummer actually starts playing the snare drum with the backbeat. And so it's like a progression and introduction of sounds. And by taking the time to build up the additive portions of the arrangement, like having the claps be the backbeat in the first chorus, and then they're present in the second chorus, but then adding the snare drum to it, it gets more exciting. It gets louder. It gets a little bit brasher. It has just more depth. So listening to compositions and acknowledging those things will really help in making arrangements continue to develop and feel interesting, and realize that there can be really interesting ways to divide up these jobs, but then unite them later in the arrangement to make something more compelling and energetic.